My name is Peyton. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my professional life, I've worked as a senior systems architect at a mid-sized tech firm in Seattle. If you met me in a meeting, you probably wouldn't remember much about me afterward. I don't interrupt. I don't dominate the room. I take notes, on paper, not just on a screen, and I ask questions that sound smaller than they are. People tend to describe me as steady, reliable, low ego. What they usually mean is non-threatening. I've always had what I call a quiet face, calm eyes, neutral tone. Even when I'm thinking 3 steps ahead, I don't perform them. In corporate spaces, especially in fast-moving tech environments, that can make you look slower than you are. Less ambitious, easier to overlook. For years I didn't mind, because invisibility, when chosen, can be power. But this story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic takedowns or explosive confrontations in glass conference rooms. It's about something quieter, something more precise. It's about what happens when your coworker steals your million-dollar project idea, presents your private notebook as his own to the CEO, gets promoted for it, and you say nothing. At least not immediately. It's about watching a perfect project launch live, while knowing you intentionally left out the one thing that would have made it stable. Not sabotage, not lies, just absence. I want to be honest about the emotional journey of this story, because what hurt the most wasn't the theft itself. It wasn't even the promotion announcement that came with applause and champagne. It was the moment I realized that everyone already believed the version of events that didn't include me. This story unfolds slowly. It starts with small cuts, the kind you explain away. The kind you rationalize because you're a team player. It moves through normalization of disrespect, then into awareness, strategy, stillness, and eventually, a consequence. If you're expecting the villain, you won't find one here. My coworker wasn't evil. He was ambitious, confident, charismatic in rooms where I preferred to observe. The system rewarded that. What it didn't account for was documentation, foresight, and patience. I'm telling this story not to glorify retaliation, but to explore a question that I think many of us quietly carry. What do you do when speaking up won't protect you, but silence might? Before we go further, let me introduce who I was back then. The version of me they thought they understood. In the company directory, my title read Senior Systems Architect. In meetings, my role was simpler than that. I was the one who cleaned things up. If someone pitched an ambitious feature without understanding infrastructure limits, I would gently outline the technical constraints. If timelines were unrealistic, I recalibrated them without embarrassing anyone. If a client asked for something flashy but unstable, I translated it into something scalable. I was the seatbelt. Necessary, uncelebrated. To most of my coworkers, I was dependable in the way office furniture is dependable. You don't praise a chair for holding weight. You just assume it will. At first, I took pride in that. I didn't need applause. I liked building systems that lasted. I liked catching vulnerabilities before they became headlines. I liked the quiet satisfaction of knowing something wouldn't break, because I had already imagined how it could. But perception is a subtle architecture too. And over time, I began to understand the shape of mine. To them, I was detail-oriented, which meant not visionary. I was thoughtful, which meant slow. I was low drama, which meant unlikely to compete. When new executives visited, they were introduced to the louder engineers first. The ones who could turn a roadmap into a TED Talk. I was introduced later, usually with something like, "And this is Peyton. She makes sure none of this explodes." Everyone would laugh. I would smile. What they didn't see was that I wasn't just preventing explosions. I was designing the entire fireproof structure behind the walls. The million-dollar project idea didn't arrive in a lightning bolt moment. It grew from months of observing patterns in our platform's vulnerabilities. I noticed recurring inefficiencies in our data validation layers. Tiny cracks that weren't urgent individually, but collectively cost the company enormous maintenance resources. I started sketching solutions in a black leather notebook I carried everywhere. It wasn't dramatic, just structured thinking. Flow diagrams, risk matrices, A modular security framework that could integrate into our existing architecture without a full rebuild. If implemented correctly, it would reduce downtime, cut support costs, and make us marketable to enterprise clients we'd been failing to secure. I didn't wave it around in meetings. I refined it quietly, because that's who I was to them, the woman who would perfect something before daring to speak about it. Around this time, Daniel transferred into our department. He was everything the company visibly rewarded. Confident, articulate, quick with metaphors that made technical concepts sound revolutionary. He had an MBA layered over a technical background, which meant he knew how to translate complexity into executive language. In meetings, he spoke early and often. Not carelessly, he was smart, but strategically. He understood optics. Within weeks, people started looping him into brainstorming sessions I'd never been invited to before. "Daniel has great energy," our director said once, smiling. "We need that kind of visibility." Visibility. I remember writing that word in the margin of my notebook and underlining it. Not angrily, just analytically. Daniel and I weren't adversaries. Not then. We collaborated on smaller initiatives. I shared technical insights freely. When he didn't understand back-end constraints, I explained them without condescension. He listened. He complimented my clarity. Once he even said, "You think 10 moves ahead. That's rare." But there's a difference between recognizing someone's depth and crediting it publicly. Gradually, in cross-functional meetings, I noticed something subtle. I would explain a concept, carefully, precisely, and the room would nod politely. Minutes later, Daniel would restate the same idea with sharper framing and more confident pacing. Suddenly, it would land. He wasn't stealing words. He was amplifying them in a way that made them sound like his. And because I didn't interrupt to reclaim them, the ownership blurred. That's the thing about invisibility. It isn't imposed in one dramatic act. It's reinforced in small, socially acceptable moments. When you choose harmony over correction. When you tell yourself, it doesn't matter who says it, as long as the idea succeeds. For a long time, I believed that. I believed good work spoke for itself. I believed integrity eventually surfaced. And I believed that if I kept building quietly, the architecture of my effort would be undeniable. I wasn't naive, but I underestimated how quickly perception solidifies around the version of you that's most convenient. To them, I was the stabilizer, the support beam, not the visionary, not the driver, certainly not the owner. And that misunderstanding would become the foundation for everything that followed. The first cut didn't bleed. That's why I almost ignored it. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in conference room B, the one with the flickering overhead light and the glass wall that made every conversation feel slightly performative. We were reviewing early concepts for what leadership was calling our Enterprise Expansion Initiative. It wasn't a formal project yet, just an exploratory discussion. I had spent the previous weekend organizing my notebook sketches into something more coherent. Not a presentation, just structured thinking. A layered security framework that could integrate into our platform without rewriting the core architecture. Efficient, scalable, quietly transformative. When the director asked if anyone had thoughts on how we could make our product more appealing to enterprise clients, I spoke. Not dramatically, not with a slide deck. I described the modular patch system I'd been mapping. How could we implement tiered validation layers that activate dynamically based on client risk profiles? How this would reduce operational strain while increasing perceived security maturity. I watched the room, a few nods, one person typing notes, no interruption. Then Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. He didn't speak immediately. He waited, just long enough for the silence to stretch. "That's interesting," he said thoughtfully. "What if we frame that as a flexible security accelerator? Instead of just internal optimization, we could position it as a competitive differentiator. Same core concept, sharper packaging." He stood up and moved to the whiteboard. He redrew my layered structure, but simplified. Renamed components. Added a bold heading at the top. Enterprise Adaptive Shield. The room shifted. People leaned forward. Our director smiled. "Now that's compelling." I felt something small tighten in my chest. Not rage, not even jealousy. Recognition. This was the first time I saw the mechanism clearly. It wasn't that he dismissed my idea. He built on it, publicly, confidently, in a way that attached his voice to its evolution. And because I didn't say, yes, that's exactly what I outlined, the ownership narrative began forming without me. After the meeting, Daniel caught up to me by the coffee machine. "Hey," he said warmly. "Your modular idea? That's strong. We should collaborate on fleshing it out." Collaborate. The word landed gently, almost generously. I nodded. "Sure. I have detailed notes already. I can share them." His smile widened just slightly. "Perfect. Let's turn it into something leadership can really get behind." There was nothing overtly wrong with that exchange. No hostility. No manipulation you could point at and circle in red. That's why it was easy to dismiss the discomfort. That evening, I scanned my notebook pages and emailed them to him. Organized, annotated, clean diagrams, risk assessments, implementation phases. He responded within an hour. "This is gold. I'll synthesize it into a strategic outline for next week's check-in." I remember staring at that sentence. I'll synthesize it. No, we'll present it, not let's co-author it. But I told myself I was being sensitive. Invisibility trains you to doubt your own perception. The following week, during the executive check-in, Daniel presented. He referenced months of thinking about how we could reposition our platform for enterprise growth. He described the modular layers, the adaptive activation, the cost reduction projections, my projections. He didn't claim he built it alone, but he didn't clarify otherwise either. And in rooms like that, ambiguity favors the speaker. I sat there, hands folded loosely on the table, listening to my architecture translated through someone else's cadence. At one point, our CEO looked directly at Daniel and said, "This is the kind of forward thinking we need." Applause followed. Light, professional, approving. No one looked at me. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost invisible. Afterward, Daniel thanked me again privately. "Couldn't have shaped it without your technical depth." "Shaped it," I smiled politely. And for the first time, I wrote something different in the margin of my notebook that night. Not a diagram, not a risk matrix, just a sentence. Credit flows toward confidence, not origin. I didn't confront him. I didn't escalate it. I didn't even mention it to anyone else. Because at that stage, I still believed the system would eventually notice patterns. I believed substance would outlast packaging. But something had shifted. I was no longer unaware. I was observing. And observation, when sustained long enough, becomes strategy. If the first cut was subtle, the next ones were quieter still. That's how normalization works. Nothing dramatic enough to protest. Nothing blatant enough to escalate. Just repetition. Polite, professional, deniable repetition. After the executive check-in, the enterprise adaptive shield concept started gaining traction. Leadership requested a formal proposal. A budget outline. A phased rollout plan. Daniel was officially named project lead. It made sense on paper. He had presented it. He had momentum. And I, true to my reputation, was assigned technical oversight. Oversight, not ownership. When the internal announcement went out, my name appeared in the third paragraph. Special thanks to Peyton for supporting the architecture validation. Supporting. I read that sentence twice. I told myself it didn't matter. Titles didn't build systems. Work did. So I kept working. In weekly meetings, I would flag implementation risks. Subtle ones. Integration bottlenecks. Data latency issues if the activation layers weren't sequenced properly. Daniel would nod, thank me, then rephrase my concerns as strategic optimization opportunities. The room preferred that language. Sometimes he would say, "Peyton's team will handle that," even though I didn't have a team assigned yet. It was a soft way of relocating responsibility downward while keeping direction upward. No one corrected him, and I didn't either. That was my rationalization phase. I told myself collaboration required flexibility. Those ego battles derailed progress. That being above credit was a kind of moral high ground. But there's a difference between humility and erasure. The real turning point in this phase wasn't a meeting. It was a slack thread. A junior engineer had asked a question about the modular validation triggers, specifically, how they would respond under concurrent client load. Before I could answer, Daniel jumped in with a simplified explanation. It was technically incomplete, not wrong, just missing the conditional failover logic I had designed to prevent cascading crashes. I replied beneath his message, adding the nuance, clarifying edge cases, attaching a small diagram. A minute later, Daniel edited his original message to incorporate my additions, without tagging me. The thread now read as though he had explained it fully from the start. It was efficient, seamless, and telling. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. That was the moment I realized something uncomfortable. He wasn't consciously stealing, he was absorbing. And because I kept supplying clarity without claiming authorship, the absorption looked natural. In meetings, he began using phrases I had written verbatim in my notebook. Dynamic risk-weighted activation. Scalable integrity layering. They sounded sharper in his voice, louder. Once, a product manager complimented him directly. "You always think about long-term resilience." He smiled. "I try." I remember thinking, no, I do. But the thought never left my mind. Instead, I doubled down on competence. If my visibility was low, my work would be undeniable. I documented everything meticulously. Design decisions, security caveats, phase dependencies. Not out of suspicion, just discipline. At least, that's what I told myself. Privately, I began noticing how often meetings opened with Daniel summarizing where we are on the project before anyone else could speak. It set the narrative frame. And whoever frames the narrative owns it. When the performance review season approached, our director met with me. "You're invaluable to this initiative," he said warmly. "Daniel brings the big picture energy, but you're the backbone." Backbone. It was meant as praise, but backbones don't get promoted. Faces do. I walked home that evening in the Seattle drizzle, replaying the conversation. There was no malice in it, no cruelty, just categorization. I had been assigned a role, reliable, useful, invisible, and the longer I accepted it quietly, the more natural it became for everyone else. That's the danger of the normalized disrespect. It doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like gravity. A gentle, consistent force pushing you into a shape you never actively chose. The project budget was approved the following month. Nearly $1 million allocated for development, marketing positioning, and enterprise outreach. The internal memo named Daniel as Director of Strategic Innovation, effective immediately. Promotion tied to project leadership. I congratulated him. He hugged me lightly in the hallway. "We did it," he said. "We." I smiled, but something inside me had stopped rationalizing. I was still silent, but the silence no longer came from humility. It came from calculation. Promotions change how people look at you. Daniel's new title, Director of Strategic Innovation, shifted the energy in every room he entered. Executives now deferred slightly when he spoke. Product managers looped him into early-stage ideation. His calendar is filled with external partner calls. Mine is filled with implementation timelines. I wasn't resentful. I was observant. In our first post-promotion strategy session, I noticed something almost anthropological. When Daniel outlined ambitious milestones, the room leaned forward with anticipation. When I raised feasibility concerns, the room leaned back into practicality. He was an aspiration. I was gravity. Neither role is inherently wrong, but only one gets spotlighted. As the million-dollar project moved into full development, expectations crystallized. Daniel handled stakeholder communication, investor decks, and executive updates. I handled architecture validation, system integrity, and security hardening. One afternoon, our director pulled me aside after a meeting. "You're exactly what this project needs," he said. "Steady hands. Daniel thrives on momentum. You keep it grounded." It was said with sincerity. But sincerity doesn't change structure. I began noticing how often decisions were made in rooms I wasn't invited to. Rooms where positioning was discussed, where features were prioritized for optics rather than resilience. Later, those decisions would arrive in my inbox as directives. "Can we implement X by Q3? Is it possible to simplify the authentication layer for demo purposes?" Each time I would respond carefully. "Yes, but with conditions. Yes, if we maintain the integrity thresholds. Yes, provided we don't compromise patch sequencing." And each time, those caveats felt like footnotes to someone else's headline. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from being the adult in the room without being treated as the authority. I wasn't marginalized loudly. I was relied upon quietly. When external partners joined demo calls, Daniel introduced me as our technical brain. It was meant to elevate me, but the phrasing subtly separated thinking from leading. Brain, not voice. During one particularly tense timeline review, a marketing lead asked whether we could accelerate launch by 2 months to align with a major industry conference. Daniel looked at me. The room followed. I understood the choreography instantly. I was expected to evaluate feasibility and absorb responsibility for whatever answer I gave. If we remove the secondary validation layer, I said evenly, we could accelerate, but it would increase long-term maintenance risk and expose us to security vulnerabilities under high concurrency. Silence. Daniel tilted his head slightly. What if we patch those later? There it was. The role assignment is in real time. He proposed a bold movement. I provided caution. And if anything went wrong, the architecture would be mine to defend. I held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. Not confrontational, just steady. Patches aren't cosmetic, I replied. They're structural. The conversation moved on. No decision was made that day, but I understood something fundamental. I had been cast as the stabilizer in a narrative driven by spectacle. Reliable, useful, invisible. And invisibility comes with an assumption that you will continue to absorb impact without protest, that you will correct errors quietly, that you will protect the system, even if the system doesn't protect you. Around this time, Daniel asked if he could borrow my physical notebook. I love how you map things visually, he said casually one evening. It helps me think through stakeholder explanations. The request felt intimate in a professional way. My notebook wasn't just scratch paper. It was months of structured reasoning, cross-referenced vulnerabilities, and phased security integrations. But we were collaborators. That's what I told myself. Just for the weekend? He clarified. I hesitated half a second too long. He noticed, but smiled reassuringly. I'll take good care of it. I handed it over. That moment wasn't dramatic. No ominous music. No internal alarm bells screaming. Just a subtle awareness that I was giving someone access not only to my work, but to the scaffolding beneath it. On Monday, he returned it with a grateful nod. Incredibly helpful, he said. You see patterns most people miss. Most people. I thanked him lightly, and I began to realize that the role I had been assigned wasn't accidental. It was convenient. If something succeeded, the visible leader would be celebrated. If something failed, the invisible architect would be responsible. For the first time, I stopped asking whether that was fair. Instead, I asked something quieter. What happens if the stabilizer decides not to compensate for the imbalance? That question didn't come from anger. It came from clarity. And clarity changes everything. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during the promotion announcement, or the Slack edits, or even when Daniel borrowed my notebook. It happened on a Tuesday morning at 6:40 a.m., alone in the office kitchen. I get in early. Always have. The building is different before 9. Quieter, less performative. The hum of servers in the distance feels more honest than conversation. I was pouring hot water into a chipped ceramic mug when I saw the email. Subject line: Executive Pre-Launch Briefing. Final Architecture Overview. Daniel was presenting to the CEO that afternoon. That part wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the attachment. Enterprise Adaptive Shield, Final Vision Deck. Vision. I opened it. Slide 1. Bold typography, confident language. His name is under the title. Slide 5. A simplified diagram of the modular validation layers. My layers. Redrawn. Cleaned up. Strategically branded. Slide 9. Integrated security patching strategy. I felt my breath slow, not quicken, because I knew what that slide was supposed to include. I clicked forward. There it was. A high-level mention of patch deployment cycles. Risk mitigation language. Assurances about system resilience under enterprise load. What wasn't there was the core. The critical secondary validation patch set I had designed months ago. The one that prevented cascading failures under concurrent data stress. The one I had flagged repeatedly in timeline discussions. It wasn't in the deck, not visually, not in the appendix, not in the rollout phases. At first, I assumed it was an oversight. Maybe he planned to discuss it verbally. But then I opened the technical implementation document attached to the same email. It was structured based on the notebook pages I had shared, except for one difference. The section detailing the secondary validation patch sequence, my most carefully constructed safeguard, was summarized into 2 vague bullet points. Additional failover logic to be integrated post-launch as needed. Post-launch, as needed. I leaned against the counter, mug warming my palms. And for the first time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt still, because I understood what had happened. In preparing for the executive narrative, Daniel had optimized for simplicity, for momentum, for a clean launch aligned with the industry conference timeline. Marketing wanted. The secondary patch layer complicated the story. It extended development time. It forced conversations about risk tolerance, so he minimized it, not maliciously, strategically. He believed the system would hold. He believed the initial layer was good enough for launch optics. He believed patches could follow later. And maybe, under moderate load, he was right. But enterprise clients don't test systems moderately. They test them all at once. I walked back to my desk and opened my own master documentation file. The complete architecture map. Every dependency. Every stress test scenario. Every vulnerability simulation I had run quietly over months. I reviewed the concurrency modeling data. Without the secondary validation patch fully integrated at launch, the system wouldn't implode instantly. It would pass demos. It would function under controlled environments. But under live enterprise onboarding, multiple large clients activating simultaneously, the risk of cascading authentication failures increased exponentially. Not a guaranteed crash, but a highly probable one. I sat with that information. For years, my instinct in moments like this would have been immediate correction. I would have drafted an email, requested a meeting, flagged the risk in bold. I would have protected the system, protected the company, protected Daniel from himself. That's who I had been. But something inside me had changed. Not into vindictiveness, into awareness of the pattern. Every time I compensated quietly, the narrative remained unchanged. He was visionary. I was supported. If I corrected this, again, before launch, the project would succeed. He would be celebrated, and my role would remain structurally invisible. The company would benefit, and I would remain the backbone. Backbones don't get equity conversations. Backbones don't get board visibility. They get thanked privately. I closed the document, not in anger, in a decision. Silence, I realized, isn't passive by default. Sometimes it's the only variable left to test. That afternoon, I attended the executive briefing. I watched Daniel present the architecture confidently. I listened as he assured the CEO that our system was enterprise-ready. I noticed how smoothly he moved through slides built from my diagrams. When the CEO asked, "Are we fully secure at projected scale?" Daniel answered without hesitation, "Yes." He glanced at me briefly when he said it, just a flicker. A silent check-in. I met his eyes, and I nodded once. No agreement. Acknowledgement. That was the day something shifted. Not because I chose revenge, but because I chose not to intercept the consequence. And in complex systems, technical or human, removing the stabilizer changes everything. After the executive briefing, something subtle changed in the office atmosphere. Daniel walked differently. Not arrogantly, just assured. The CEO had approved the accelerated launch timeline. Marketing had locked in the industry conference reveal. Investors were being briefed. Momentum had solidified into inevitability. And I said nothing. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear this story. They assume silence is weakness, or fear, or resentment swallowed too long. But my silence, from that point forward, was measured, deliberate. I still did my job. I reviewed code commits. I attended sprint planning. I flagged obvious integration bugs. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't withhold information that was directly requested. I simply stopped volunteering for the deeper safeguards that weren't being prioritized. When developers asked about patch sequencing, I provided the documentation that had been officially approved for Phase 1. When they inquired about advanced failover simulations, I answered truthfully, those are slated for post-launch optimization, which was technically accurate. The secondary validation patch, the one that stabilized high concurrency authentication storms, was categorized as Phase 2. Daniel had approved that classification, not me. In meetings, I became quieter, not withdrawn, just precise. When timeline optimism surfaced, I no longer layered in hypothetical disaster modeling unless someone explicitly requested it. They rarely did. Optimism is contagious in corporate spaces. So is selective hearing. One afternoon, a junior engineer approached my desk. "I've been running load tests," he said. "Under extreme simulated concurrency, we're seeing minor authentication lag. Nothing catastrophic, just spikes." I looked at his data. The spikes were early tremors, predictable. "Document it," I said calmly. "Add it to the performance log." "Should we escalate?" he asked. I paused, not theatrically, just thoughtfully. "It's within current launch tolerance," I replied, which, again, was technically true. Launch tolerance had been defined narrowly. He nodded and walked away. I felt the weight of that moment more than I expected. Not guilt, responsibility redistributed. For years, I had carried invisible risk on behalf of others' ambitions. Quietly patching, reinforcing, stabilizing. Now, I was allowing the architecture to reflect the decisions actually made, not the ones I would have preferred. Silence became data. Daniel interpreted my reduced input as alignment. "Love how streamlined everything feels lately," he said during one check-in. "We're finally moving fast." I studied his expression. He genuinely believed speed equaled progress. "I'm glad it feels efficient," I replied. He smiled, satisfied. What he didn't notice was that I had begun documenting differently. Not just technical decisions, but authorship trails, meeting summaries, Slack confirmations, version histories with timestamps clearly indicating who approved what and when. Not to threaten, to preserve truth. Because if systems fail, narratives rewrite quickly. And I had no intention of being rewritten as negligent. The week before launch, we conducted a full internal demo. Controlled environment, simulated enterprise dashboard, carefully managed load levels. It performed beautifully. Applause filled the conference room. Marketing clapped first. The CEO nodded with visible approval. Daniel received a congratulatory handshake. I received a grateful glance. "Couldn't have done it without the team," he said graciously. Team. It was a generous word, broad enough to blur edges. That night, alone at my desk after most people had left, I ran one more private stress simulation. Not to intervene, to confirm. Under projected real-world concurrency, multiple enterprise clients onboarding within the first 48 hours post-launch. The authentication queues bottlenecked. Secondary validation failed to distribute properly without the full patch layer active. Cascading retries, server strain, eventual timeout failures, not immediate collapse. Gradual destabilization, enough to damage credibility. I saved the simulation results in a secure folder. Dated, timestamped, and then I closed my laptop. Silence is only dangerous when it's unconscious. Mine wasn't. Mine was a boundary. For the first time in my career, I allowed leadership decisions to carry their natural weight. No correction, no preemptive rescue, just architecture reflecting authorship. Launch day was 3 days away, and for the first time, I wasn't bracing to protect something at my own expense. I was watching, calmly, patiently. Quiet dominance isn't loud, it's restraint. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like normalcy. The 3 days leading up to launch were filled with surface-level chaos. Final marketing assets, investor teasers, and last-minute UI polish. Slack channels buzzed with optimism. The word transformational appeared more than once in executive emails, and I continued behaving exactly as expected, calm, precise, reliable. What they never noticed was that my preparation had shifted focus. I wasn't preparing the system anymore. I was preparing the record. Every architectural decision from the previous 4 months had a trail, some clearer than others. I began organizing them into a chronological map. Not emotionally, not defensively, just methodically. Meeting transcripts exported, Slack threads archived, version control logs annotated. In software development, authorship is traceable if you know where to look. Commits don't lie. Timestamped approvals don't reinterpret themselves. I created a private document titled Project Evolution, Decision Log. Under each major structural change, I noted original proposal, revised executive framing, risk advisories given, final approval authority. I didn't invent anything. I simply aligned reality in sequence. What fascinated me, almost academically, was how small language shifts over time had redirected ownership. Peyton's modular safeguard had gradually become our adaptive security model. Our adaptive security model had evolved into Daniel's enterprise shield framework. No confrontation, just erosion. Meanwhile, I kept running simulations privately, not obsessively, just enough to confirm my earlier projections. Under real enterprise conditions, multiple large clients onboarding within hours, the system's primary validation layer would hold temporarily. But without the full secondary patch integration, authentication requests would begin stacking. Retry loops would amplify strain. Internal queues would spike. The architecture wouldn't explode. It would suffocate. The difference matters. Explosions create sympathy. Suffocation creates blame. I saved each simulation output with neutral file names. I wasn't planning to leak anything recklessly. But if questioned later, I would have evidence that risk modeling had existed long before launch day. One evening, Daniel stopped by my desk. "Big week," he said, smiling. "Feels surreal." "It does," I replied. He leaned casually against the partition. "After this, there's talk about expanding the innovation division. I'll probably need someone to run technical strategy beneath me." Beneath. The word hovered between us, almost invisible. "You'd be perfect for that," he added. There was no malice in his tone. He believed he was offering growth, a promotion nested inside his. I studied him quietly. "Congratulations," I said. "That's exciting." He grinned. "Couldn't have built this without you." There it was again. Built, as though architecture simply materialized around presentation. After he left, I opened my notebook, the physical one. The black leather cover is slightly worn at the edges. Pages dense with diagrams, cross-references, vulnerability trees. This object had been presented to the CEO weeks earlier as inspiration material. Daniel had referenced my strategic research journal during that briefing. He hadn't said it was his. He also hadn't said it wasn't. Ambiguity had done the work for him. I turned to the section outlining the secondary validation patch, the one intentionally categorized as Phase 2. There was a note I had written months ago in the margin. "Do not deploy without this layer under projected enterprise concurrency." It wasn't dramatic, just factual. I took a photo of that page and stored it in the same secure folder as the simulation results. Not as ammunition, as memory insurance. Launch day arrived faster than expected. The conference venue buzzed with energy. Investors, partners, tech journalists, everyone eager for innovation narratives. Daniel took the stage, confident, polished, charismatic. The demo environment ran flawlessly under controlled load. Applause rippled through the room when he announced immediate enterprise onboarding availability. I stood at the side of the stage with the engineering team, hands folded loosely in front of me. No spotlight, no microphone, just observation. Enterprise clients began signing onboarding agreements within hours. Real ones, large ones. By the end of the first day, 3 major companies had initiated integrations simultaneously. Exactly the concurrency scenario I had modeled. No one noticed me leaving early that evening. Back home, I opened my laptop and accessed the live monitoring dashboard. Authentication queues were already higher than demo projections. Not critical. Yet, I closed the dashboard, turned off the screen, and went to sleep calmly. Because what they never noticed wasn't anger. It was patience. Systems reveal the truth eventually. You just have to stop interrupting them. The first alert came at 2:17 a.m. Not catastrophic. Not red banner catastrophic. Just an amber notification on my phone. Authentication latency exceeding projected thresholds. I didn't sit up in panic. I had been expecting it. I opened the monitoring dashboard from bed, the room still dark around me. 3 enterprise clients were actively onboarding. Their internal teams were stress testing the platform simultaneously, importing bulk user data, and triggering validation checks across thousands of accounts at once. The primary layer held, for now, but the queue depth was rising. Retries were beginning to stack. I watched the metrics the way a cardiologist watches an irregular heartbeat. Not emotionally, diagnostically. By 2:43 a.m., the first timeout error surfaced in the logs. Minor, isolated. But systems don't experience isolated events under sustained load. They compound. I could have messaged the on-call engineer, suggested activating the secondary validation patch manually. We had a partial version coded, just not fully integrated or tested for live deployment. Instead, I did something different. I opened my private simulation folder, I pulled up the model I had run 2 weeks earlier. Projected load curves, authentication queue saturation points, and estimated failure windows. The live dashboard now mirrored the model almost exactly. There's a strange kind of clarity when prediction aligns with reality. Not triumph, confirmation. At 3:10 a.m., Slack began lighting up, seeing elevated auth delays. Anyone else? Queue depth climbing. Retry loop looks unstable. Daniel wasn't online yet. The on-call engineer attempted incremental fixes, server scaling adjustments, cache clearing, and temporary throttling. Each measure bought minutes, not stability. At 3:32 a.m., the first enterprise client reported onboarding disruption. Polite. Concerned. By 4:05 a.m., the authentication service experienced cascading retry failures under concurrent validation checks. Not a total system crash. Worse. Intermittent instability, the kind that erodes trust quickly. I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, coffee untouched. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't anxious. I was calm in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, because this wasn't chaos. It was architecture behaving according to design choices. At 5:12 a.m., Daniel finally came online. "What's happening?" He typed into the emergency channel. Engineers flooded the thread with logs, metrics, and guesses. I waited, not to dramatize, to see if anyone mentioned the missing layer. At 5:19 a.m., one of the senior developers wrote, "Is secondary validation fully active? Under this load, it looks like only primary triggers are firing." Silence followed for several seconds. Daniel responded, "Secondary patch was scheduled for phase 2. Shouldn't be necessary for projected scale." I watched that sentence settle into the digital space. Shouldn't be necessary. The on-call engineer replied carefully, "Under simultaneous enterprise onboarding, concurrency exceeds demo projections." There it was. Reality. I finally typed. Measured. Neutral. Full secondary validation integration would distribute authentication load across modular layers. It wasn't included in phase 1 deployment. No accusation. "No, I told you so." Just architecture facts. Daniel's typing indicator flickered on and off. "Then, can we activate it now?" "Technically, yes. Practically, not without risk." It hadn't been tested under live conditions. Integrating it mid-crisis could stabilize, or compound errors. I responded truthfully. Partial activation possible. Full integration requires a structured deployment window, which we no longer had. By 6 a.m., the CEO was in the Slack channel. By 6:30 a.m., Investor Relations was drafting holding statements. The live launch announcement from the conference still echoed across social media, while enterprise onboarding quietly stalled behind authentication instability. It wasn't dramatic, it was destabilizing. And in destabilization, narratives scramble. That morning, something else became clear to me. I wasn't angry at Daniel anymore. Anger requires expectation. What I felt instead was distance. For months, I had carried the emotional labor of anticipating failure for other people's ambitions. Now, I was watching ambition encounter its own structural limits. Around 7:15 a.m., Daniel called me directly. His voice was tight but controlled. "Did we miscalculate?" I paused. "No," I said evenly. "We prioritized speed." Silence. In the background, I could hear other voices in what was likely a hastily assembled conference room. "Can you fix it?" he asked. Not defensively. Desperately. I looked at the live dashboard again. Queue depths are stabilizing slightly after emergency throttling, but still fragile. "I can implement the full secondary patch," I said. "It will take time, and it will be visible." Visible, meaning documented. Logged, attributable. He exhaled slowly. "Do it." That was the private reveal. The system is not faltering, but the shift in leverage. For the first time, correction required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement changes hierarchy. I closed my eyes briefly before opening the deployment console. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I understood something with absolute clarity. Quiet dominance isn't about causing collapse. It's about knowing exactly when you're no longer obligated to prevent it silently. When Daniel said, "Do it," something inside me didn't surge. It settled. For months, I had been operating in the margins of someone else's momentum, anticipating risk, cushioning impact, absorbing narrative distortion. Now, in a fluorescent-lit conference room somewhere across the city, he was facing the exact structural truth I had modeled from the beginning, and he was asking me to correct it. There are always multiple options at a moment like that. I could deploy the patch quietly, frame it as a routine optimization, and let the story remain intact. Visionary leader, minor technical turbulence, triumphant recovery. I could escalate aggressively. Forward archived warnings to the CEO, attach simulation logs, force a public reckoning about who designed what and who deprioritized which safeguards. Or I could choose something narrower, irreversible but controlled. I opened the deployment console and reviewed the integration checklist for the full secondary validation layer. It wasn't a simple toggle. It required synchronized server updates, queue redistribution logic, and temporary authentication freezes during migration, meaning it would be visible in logs, timestamped, attributable. Whoever initiated the structured deployment would be recorded as the primary architect of the stabilization sequence. Authorship in crisis is clearer than authorship in ideation. My phone buzzed again. A message from our CEO. Peyton, I'm told you designed the secondary validation layer. Is it ready? Not, can Daniel fix this? Not, why didn't this work? A direct question. I typed carefully. It was designed for enterprise concurrency at projected scale. It requires full integration, which was scheduled for phase 2. A pause. Then, can you integrate it now? There it was again. Not should, not why, wasn't it? Just, can you? I could feel the fork in the road. Option 1. Protect Daniel's framing. Use collective language. We'll stabilize this. Option 2. State truth plainly. Not accusatory, not dramatic, just structurally precise. I chose precision. I can lead the integration. The word lead wasn't aggressive. It was accurate. Seconds later, proceed. In the emergency Slack channel, Daniel announced, "We're activating the advanced validation architecture Peyton originally designed. She'll coordinate deployment." Originally designed. It was subtle, but it was the first public alignment of authorship I had seen. Not generous, necessary. I didn't correct the wording. I didn't embellish it. I began issuing instructions. Freeze new enterprise onboarding for 45 minutes. Redistribute authentication queues to the secondary modular layer. Prepare rollback protocol in case of unexpected collision. My tone remained the same as it had always been. Calm, steady, specific. The difference was that the room was now listening differently. Not because I spoke louder, because consequence had recalibrated attention. As engineers executed the sequence, I watched the live metrics carefully. Temporary spikes during migration. Queue reshuffling. Short-term latency increase. Then slowly stabilization. Retry loops flattened. Authentication depth is distributed evenly across layers. Server strain normalized. By 9:12 a.m., onboarding resumed. Cautiously, incrementally. An hour later, the system was functioning under sustained enterprise load without cascading failure. No applause. No celebration. Just relief. Daniel called again mid-morning. His voice was steadier now. "Thank you," he said. "I waited. For designing it that way," he added quietly. "Not for fixing it, for designing it." That distinction mattered, but gratitude wasn't the irreversible part. The irreversible part was documentation. The deployment logs clearly showed that the secondary validation architecture, authored months prior, had been absent at launch and integrated under my leadership during the crisis. The decision timeline was traceable. I didn't send those logs anywhere. I didn't need to. They existed. And existence changes power. Later that afternoon, an internal memo went out. Due to higher than anticipated enterprise onboarding volume, we accelerated integration of the advanced validation architecture developed by Peyton. Developed by Peyton. The sentence was small, but it anchored the origin. Once authorship is publicly acknowledged in a high-visibility recovery, it can't be quietly reassigned later. That was the irreversible choice. Not humiliation, not exposure, not sabotage. Visibility. Earned not through confrontation, but through consequence. I didn't destroy anything. I allowed reality to surface. And in doing so, I stepped out of the backbone role for the first time. Not by force, by fact. That night, for the first time in months, I slept without running simulations in my head. Because the system was finally reflecting its true architecture. And so was the narrative. Crisis stabilizes faster than reputation. By the next morning, the authentication failures were technically resolved. Enterprise clients received carefully worded explanations about unexpected onboarding volume and proactive infrastructure scaling. Externally, the story was controlled. Internally, it was shifting. What people don't realize about corporate ecosystems is that power rarely moves through confrontation. It moves through meeting invites. That week, I was added to 3 executive-level discussions I had never been included in before. Not as support, as primary voice. The first was a post-incident review with the CEO and senior leadership. Daniel opened the meeting with a polished summary of the launch, the instability window, and the rapid stabilization. Then he paused. "Peyton," he said, turning slightly toward me, "can you walk us through the architecture decision that prevented a larger failure?" "Not the fix, the decision. I didn't dramatize it. I explained concurrency modeling, the necessity of layered validation under enterprise-scale authentication storms, the trade-off between accelerated launch and full patch integration. No blame, no emotional undertone, just systems logic." When I finished, the CFO asked, "Why wasn't this fully integrated before launch?" The room stilled. This was the moment that defines hierarchy. Who answers, and how? Daniel inhaled slightly, preparing to respond. I spoke first, but gently. It was originally scoped for Phase 2 to meet conference timeline goals. The architecture existed. Integration timing was strategic. Strategic, not negligent, not reckless. Strategic. That word redistributed responsibility without accusation. The CEO leaned back thoughtfully. Understood. Going forward, I want an architectural sign-off required before launch commitments are finalized. Architectural sign-off, not innovation sign-off, not marketing alignment. Architectural. That single policy shift altered the power structure more than any argument could have. After the meeting, Daniel caught up to me in the hallway. "I appreciate how you handled that," he said quietly. "I handled it accurately," I replied. He nodded. For the first time since we'd started working together, there was no undertone of assumption in his expression. No unconscious belief that I would smooth over structural tension. He saw the boundary now, and boundaries recalibrate behavior. But I wasn't done moving silently. That evening, I scheduled a one-on-one with our director. Not to complain, to propose. "I'd like to formalize the validation framework as a core product pillar," I said. "Not an optimization layer, a strategic differentiator." He looked intrigued. "As in, your architecture becomes central to positioning?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "Enterprise clients care about resilience more than speed. We just proved that." Data supported me. The onboarding analytics showed that despite the instability window, clients responded positively to the transparent technical briefing we'd provided afterward. "Resilience sells." The director nodded slowly. "Draft a proposal." Draft, not assist, not support. Lead. Over the next week, I built a structured document outlining the adaptive integrity framework as a permanent branded architectural backbone of the product. This time I attached my name clearly, authored by Peyton R. Hale, Senior Systems Architect. I didn't soften it. I didn't defer. I submitted it directly to executive review. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior shifted subtly. In meetings, he began explicitly crediting technical components to me. When investors asked detailed infrastructure questions, he redirected them. "Peyton can answer that better than I can." It wasn't performative. It was corrective. Consequence had clarified competence. The most interesting part? I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. For the first time, my external role matched my internal capacity. No theatrics, no public confrontation, just structural correction. Weeks later, the CEO announced a new position, Director of Systems Strategy, reporting parallel to innovation, not beneath it. And during the announcement, he said something simple. "Resilience is leadership." That sentence wasn't about Daniel. It wasn't about the failed launch window. It was about what endured. Quiet dominance isn't loud because it doesn't need to be. It doesn't chase recognition. It waits for systems to reveal who actually understands them. And when they do, it steps forward without apology. I accepted the role without a speech. No dramatic exit. No emotional reckoning. Just evolution. The architecture had always been there. Now the visibility was too. Promotions don't always create celebration. Sometimes they create silence. When the announcement went out that I would be stepping into the newly created role of Director of Systems Strategy, the office reaction wasn't explosive. It was measured. Curious. Daniel's promotion months earlier had felt like momentum. Mine felt like recalibration. People weren't sure how to respond. In meetings that followed, I noticed something subtle. When architectural discussions surfaced, eyes shifted toward me first, not Daniel, not marketing, not product. Toward me. It wasn't about hierarchy. It was about credibility. And credibility, once publicly validated in a crisis, carries a different weight than charisma. Daniel adjusted professionally. He didn't resist the change. But I could see the recalculation happening behind his composure. He was still Director of Strategic Innovation. Still visible. Still articulate. But now, large-scale commitments require my sign-off before being finalized. Momentum had acquired friction. In our first joint executive review after the incident, he presented a bold expansion proposal, integrating our platform with a high-profile enterprise partner on an accelerated timeline. When he finished, the CEO turned to me. Feasible? The question was neutral, not loaded. I opened the proposal, scanned the concurrency projections, and answered evenly. With full secondary validation pre-integrated, yes. Without it, we risk repeating instability. The room absorbed that. No tension, just an adjustment. Daniel nodded. Then we'll integrate fully first. It was a small sentence, but it signaled learning. Consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like caution. Over the following weeks, something else shifted. How junior engineers interacted with me. They began coming directly to my office for architectural guidance, not just implementation clarification. They referenced the stabilization incident as proof that long-term modeling mattered. One of them said quietly one afternoon, "It was validating to see deep planning actually acknowledged." Acknowledged. That word stayed with me, because the real consequence wasn't Daniel's discomfort. It was the cultural shift. Where speed had once been the primary currency, resilience began gaining equal value. Marketing adjusted messaging to emphasize enterprise-grade integrity. Sales teams referenced the adaptive validation framework in pitches. My architecture wasn't a backstage safeguard anymore. It was a front-facing strategy. And Daniel, credit where it's due, adapted. He began incorporating resilience language into innovation narratives. He invited me earlier into strategic discussions instead of after timelines were drafted. There were no apologies between us. None were requested. The imbalance had corrected itself through exposure to reality. But not everyone adjusted gracefully. One product manager, frustrated by slower approval cycles, muttered during a meeting, "Do we really need this many validation layers?" Before I could answer, Daniel responded calmly, "Yes, we learned that." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. Consequence had created alignment where argument never could. Privately, I examined my own emotional landscape. I expected to feel vindicated. Instead, I felt steady, because the goal had never been humiliation. It had been accurate. The most powerful shifts in organizations don't happen when someone shouts. They happen when evidence accumulates. The launch instability wasn't catastrophic enough to destroy trust, but it was significant enough to expose structural decisions. That's the balance. Too small and it's dismissed. Too large and it becomes chaos. What happened was precise, and precision changes behavior. A month after the incident, during a leadership offsite, the CEO made an observation over dinner. "Innovation excites," he said thoughtfully, "but systems sustain." He raised his glass slightly, not theatrically, just acknowledging. The room followed, not applause, recognition, and in that quiet moment, I realized something important. The consequence wasn't Daniel losing status. It was the company redistributing respect, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. And once respect shifts structurally, it rarely returns to its old configuration. Quiet dominance doesn't crush. It outlasts. By the time the board requested a formal post-launch analysis, the technical crisis was long resolved. Metrics were stable. Enterprise onboarding resumed successfully. Revenue projections recovered. From the outside, it looked like a temporary turbulent story. One of those "we learned and grew stronger" narratives companies love to publish. But internally, something irreversible had already happened. The board didn't just want performance numbers. They wanted a sequence. Who decided what? When? Based on which assumptions? The sequence is uncomfortable. In preparation for the review, executive leadership compiled a detailed timeline of the project's evolution, from early concept to accelerated launch decision to stabilization deployment. And timelines don't flatter, they clarify. I was invited, not as a witness, but as a primary contributor to the architecture segment. Daniel prepared the innovation narrative. Vision, market opportunity, competitive positioning. I prepared the structural map. When we entered the boardroom, there was no hostility in the air, just scrutiny. The CEO opened with a measured tone. We experienced higher than anticipated concurrency during launch. We responded quickly and stabilized. Then the slide changed. Architecture timeline. My slide, Not labeled as mine, but unmistakably reflecting my documentation. Original modular safeguard proposal. Secondary validation layer specification. Phase 2 categorization. Crisis integration and deployment. Dates aligned precisely with version control logs. One board member leaned forward. Why was the full validation layer scheduled post-launch? Daniel answered first. To align with conference timing and market momentum. No deflection, no reframing, just truth. The board member nodded slowly. And had it been integrated earlier, the instability window would likely have been avoided? I spoke evenly. Yes. Silence settled. Not heavy, just definitive. There was no reprimand, no raised voices, no dramatic fallout. That's the thing about high-level consequence. It rarely explodes. It recalibrates quietly. After the meeting, the board issued a new governance guideline. Major product launches require documented architectural risk sign-off at the board review stage, not executive discretion. Board visibility. That policy wasn't about punishment. It was about prevention. But prevention shifts authority. Daniel's department would now need formal structural approval before marketing timelines were announced publicly. He didn't lose his title. He lost unilateral momentum. And that's different. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something subtle in his demeanor. Not resentment. Reflection. In one late afternoon meeting, just the two of us reviewing a new proposal, he paused mid-sentence. I underestimated the cost of simplification, he said quietly. It wasn't an apology. It was an admission. I looked at the concurrency projections on the screen. Complexity isn't the enemy, I replied. Unexamined optimism is. He nodded slowly. There are moments in professional relationships where hierarchy dissolves and clarity replaces it. This was one of them. Too late to fix the original narrative? Yes. The story of who led the launch would always carry his name. But it was also too late to erase the authorship of the architecture that saved it. That acknowledgement had entered board records. It existed in minutes, and board minutes don't forget. The irreversible part wasn't the system failure. It was the documented recognition of structural foresight. From that point forward, innovation proposals came to me earlier, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. Engineers referenced the launch incident as a case study in onboarding training, not to shame, to teach. And Daniel, credit to him, never attempted to rewrite history. He referenced the secondary validation layer openly in subsequent presentations. Built by Peyton, he would say when explaining resilience improvements. Not theatrically, accurately. Too late to avoid consequences, but not too late to evolve. Quiet dominance doesn't require someone else to fall. It requires truth to be recorded. And once recorded, truth adjusts systems on its own. The launch crash wasn't catastrophic. It was corrective. And correction, when embraced rather than resisted, becomes growth. But growth always costs something. In this case, it cost illusion. And illusions, once broken in front of a boardroom, can't be quietly restored. The confrontation didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened 3 weeks later, in Daniel's office, late in the evening, when most of the floor had emptied. He had asked if we could reset alignment. The phrasing was corporate, neutral. But the request carried weight. His office overlooked the city. Glass walls, soft lighting, framed innovation awards already lining one shelf. When I stepped inside, he closed the door gently, not dramatically. There was no tension in my body, no rehearsed speech, just stillness. He gestured toward the chair across from him. I owe you a conversation, he said. I waited, not expectantly, just attentively. I didn't intend to sideline you, he began. When we first shaped the project, I genuinely saw it as collaborative. But somewhere along the way, I started believing my own framing. He didn't look defensive, he looked precise. I simplified the architecture narrative for momentum, he continued. And I convinced myself the secondary layer could wait. I didn't fully weigh what that meant for you. For you, not just for the system. That distinction mattered. I folded my hands loosely in my lap. You optimized for speed, I said calmly. I optimized for stability. He nodded. And I let the company assume speed equaled leadership. There it was. Not theft, not villainy. Assumption. I should have clarified authorship earlier, he added. Especially with the notebook. The notebook. The image flickered briefly in my mind. Him presenting diagrams drawn from pages I had spent months refining. You presented it as strategic research, I said evenly. You didn't correct the inference. He held my gaze. You're right. Silence settled between us, not uncomfortable, just honest. This wasn't a shouting match. There was no raised voice, no emotional unraveling, just recalibration. I don't want to compete with you, he said finally. I want to build something that actually lasts. His words weren't dramatic. They were subdued, real. For a moment, I considered the earlier version of myself, the one who would have downplayed everything, reassured him, smoothed the edges. Instead, I chose clarity. I'm not competing, I said, but I won't be invisible again. No accusation, no bitterness, just boundary. He inhaled slowly, then nodded. Understood. That was the confrontation. No explosions, no ultimatums, no emotional victory laps, just acknowledgement of imbalance, and agreement not to repeat it. As I stood to leave, he added one more sentence. You could have exposed me. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. I didn't need to, I replied, because that's the truth. I never leaked confidential documents. I never humiliated him publicly. I never orchestrated destruction. I allowed the consequence. There's a difference. As I walked back to my office, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because he admitted fault, but because I no longer needed him to. Authority had shifted structurally. Documentation existed. The board had visibility. My role was defined. His acknowledgement was simply the final alignment. The next morning, in our joint leadership meeting, he introduced a new initiative and paused deliberately. Architectural review led by Peyton will precede all launch commitments, he said clearly. No hesitation, no softening. The room nodded, not surprised. Aligned. Confrontation without heat is powerful because it removes drama from truth. When no one is screaming, you can't dismiss the message as emotion. You have to face it as a fact, and facts, once calmly spoken, reshape rooms. I didn't walk away with triumph. I walked away with equilibrium. The system was balanced now. So was I. It's been a year since the launch incident. If you walked into our office today, you wouldn't see tension lingering in the air. You'd see a company that talks about resilience with the same enthusiasm it once reserved only for disruption. And you'd see me, still calm, still measured, but not invisible. My title changed, yes. Director of Systems Strategy sounds more authoritative than Senior Systems Architect. It places me in rooms where timelines are shaped, not just corrected. But the deeper shift wasn't external. It was internal. For most of my career, I believed integrity meant absorbing imbalance quietly. That if I built well enough, consistently enough, recognition would eventually surface on its own. Sometimes it does. But more often, systems reward visibility unless integrity insists on being seen. The old version of me would have prevented the launch instability at any cost, including my own authorship. I would have corrected the architecture silently, allowed momentum to continue uninterrupted, and remained the reliable backbone in someone else's narrative. The new version of me understands something different. Stability is not the same as self-erasure. Resilience does not require invisibility. And leadership is not volume. It's clarity. Daniel and I still work together. Our dynamic is different now. Not tense, not competitive, balanced. He brings energy and external momentum. I bring structural foresight. But now, when he references innovation, he includes architecture by default. When I outline risk modeling, I do it without shrinking the language. We don't overcorrect into artificial harmony. We operate with defined edges. The notebook still sits on my desk. Same black leather cover. Same dense diagrams. But now, when I bring it into meetings, I don't position it as background thinking. I open it visibly. I reference it directly. I attach my name to its pages when ideas transition into proposals. Not aggressively, simply, because authorship matters. Not for ego, but for accountability. What changed most is how I experience silence. Before, my silence was a habit, a way of maintaining peace, a reflex toward harmony. Now my silence is chosen. If I don't speak, it's because I've decided observation serves the moment better than intervention. Not because I fear disrupting perception. There's a difference. The company culture shifted too. Junior engineers no longer apologize for raising structural concerns in early-stage discussions. Let's run it through validation first has become standard language, not resistance. That matters more to me than my title. Because quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about altering patterns so they don't repeat. When I look back at the day Daniel presented my notebook to the CEO, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel recognition. He moved the way the system had trained him to move. Reward speed, frame boldly, assume stabilization will follow. I moved the way I had been trained. Anticipate collapse, prevent it quietly, accept limited visibility. Both patterns were incomplete. The launch instability forced both of us to evolve, not through humiliation, through consequence. And consequently, when allowed to unfold naturally, teaches better than confrontation ever could. If you met me now, you might still describe me as steady, thoughtful, low drama. That hasn't changed. What's changed is this. When I design something critical, I don't leave my name in the margins anymore. I write it clearly at the top, not because I need applause, but because clarity prevents erasure. And I have no interest in disappearing again. If you've stayed with me this long, you might be expecting a sharper ending, a dramatic downfall, a public humiliation, a moment where I stand in the center of a room and say, "I told you so." That never happened. And I'm glad it didn't, because this story was never about revenge. It was about restraint. When my coworker presented my notebook as his own to the CEO, and he accelerated the launch without the full security patch I had designed, I had options. I could have confronted him immediately, escalated, exposed, protected him again quietly. Instead, I did something different. I stopped interrupting the consequence. I didn't sabotage the system. I didn't leak confidential documents recklessly. I didn't orchestrate failure. I allowed the architecture to reflect the decisions that were made. And when the perfect project destabilized under live enterprise load, because the critical validation layer had been intentionally left for phase 2, I stepped forward and integrated the very safeguard that had been minimized. Not angrily, not theatrically, just accurately. The moral isn't let things burn. It's this. If you are always the one preventing collapse without acknowledgement, eventually you become invisible to the very structure you're holding up. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't a louder effort. It's strategic silence. Silence that says, I will do my job. I will design with integrity. But I will not erase myself to protect someone else's narrative. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering people. It's about knowing your value so clearly that you don't rush to defend it. You let reality demonstrate it. In the end, no one was destroyed. But illusions were, and once illusions fall, systems mature. If you've ever watched someone take credit for your work, if you've ever been labeled reliable while someone else was labeled visionary, if you've ever felt the tension between speaking up and being strategic, I'm curious, when would you choose to intervene? And when would you allow consequences to teach instead? Tell me in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.